Hey everyone. So in this video, we want to talk about the attribute adjust nodes. And when you look at the date of this video, you will see that it's a video that I recorded relatively late. And that's partly because the nodes are relatively new. They only exist for about 2 years, but also because I basically have to get used to them myself. I usually use other nodes to get the effects that I'm going to show you. And the reason is that those nodes kind of don't have a clear one-dimensional purpose. They do all kinds of things. So it's kind of tricky to explain them in a particular context. Because usually what I do is when I need a noise, I use an attribute noise node. When I need something that is random, I use an attribute random node. If I want to change the color, I use the color node. You know, it's quite logical to understand. But those nodes come from a different direction. They basically think in terms of what kind of data do you want to change. So if you want to do anything with color, then you can use the attribute adjust color node. If you want to do anything with vectors, you can do that with the attribute adjust vector and so on. So you will see what I mean by that, and I will not always during the course use those nodes where I could use them. And I encourage you to try to use those nodes even though I'm not always using them in the course. Because as usual in Houdini, you always have multiple ways of doing things, and the attribute adjust nodes are actually pretty powerful, but sometimes I have a hard time kind of remembering using them, but very often I will try to, sprinkle them in whenever I remember that I could do something with those as well. So that's all a little bit theoretical. Let's finally jump in and let's start with the attribute adjust color node because I think it's the easiest to understand. So what I have here is a alembic of a statue, and of course I first check if the scale is okay, and then I scale it accordingly, and then I convert it so that I don't have to work with packed geometry. So the usual things. So thanks Tommy, and now I want to, let's say, change the color. So what I can do is I can use the color node and for example, set it to random, and in this case it means random colors for each point, or maybe for each face when I set it to primitive. We have seen that before. Now an alternative to this is the attribute adjust color node, and this is basically kind of an advanced version of the color node because it has built in all kinds of functions that have something to do with color. So of course what you can do is you can, by the default adjust value, you can set the color to a constant, just like the color node. You can set it to random, just like the color node. But the first difference is when you set it to random, you get a color ramp. So you can actually change what colors you want to have, and we will talk about this in a second. But you also have the function of using noise, for example. So instead of using a noise node, I can use an attribute adjust color and set it to noise, and then again I have a lot of functions that I could use to control this. And here I have element size and all that, but it already gives me a certain color ramp that I can use for that, like with the attribute noise node, but with a lot more control to it. But there's much more even. There's, for example, the line function, which means when you press enter in the viewport, you can actually create a gradient that is relative to the position of the beginning and the end point of this line. So this allows for things that would otherwise be pretty complicated. Or instead of a line, you could use a radial where you have a center and a radius, where the color changes, again, based on a ramp that you can change, based on where you position that in space. Another thing is the bounding box, which basically takes, literally the bounding box of our object and applies the color ramp according to that, and you can define in which direction you want it to go. So instead of creating a line yourself, you can say, okay, the color should change in the Z direction of my object or in the Y direction of my object, so that it always looks for the lowest and the highest point no matter what your object is, and colorizes it by the ramp. And again, you can change this for the 3 directions you want. You can even change where it starts and where it ends, so you can do all kinds of interesting things with that. I will not go through everything that is here because it's frankly too much, but a couple of things I want to point out that are pretty powerful about the node. One thing is you can actually color correct with this. And this is something that, to my knowledge, isn't there in Houdini in any other way. There is no color correction node or something, but you can do that with the attribute adjust color. So for example, let's say I have this statue here and painted it in a weird way, with colors that are a bit, weird because they're way too saturated, and I only realized that too late, which is actually often the case. Then how can I change the saturation only without having to repaint the whole thing? And this again is where the attribute adjust color comes in, because if you turn off the adjust value function, you can actually just activate the enable color correction. And here, for example, you can just change the saturation afterwards. So this is a pretty powerful tool. But of course, as you can see, you can also do other things like a hue shift, or you can do a brightness shift. So basic color correction functions you can actually now do on the color attribute. Actually, you could even do it on any other attribute because you can change the attribute up here if you want. So color correction is a very important tool that comes with the attribute adjust color node. And then there is the function that we've already seen, which is pretty cool. And that is, instead of having completely random color, you can actually control them by a certain palette. So what I mean by that is when we look at, for example, our example from before, our nice little forest here, you notice that one thing that stands out is that the green color is always the same for every single tree, which is a bit annoying. So what we've seen before is we could, on the points, just use, for example, attribute randomize to change the color by just setting the attribute to CD, which is already default. The problem with that is you get completely random colors that make no sense for trees. Now, an alternative to this would have been a color node, of course, because as we know, we can use it to just set it to random, and then you have the same effect, but here you have even less options to change the colors. And while there is a rem from attribute, which I usually use for this technique, it needs an attribute that you need to create first. And I think we will see this technique later on. But for now, let's ignore that, because I want to show you, of course, that the attribute adjust color node can do this for you relatively easily, because this is basically already the default setting if you set it to random, because then instantly you get this ramp that you can change to your liking. Maybe let's get rid of the blue shades. So here, of course, you can, do whatever you want and find the colors that you feel more natural. But if you want to have a quick result, it's pretty nice, because here there's a little cogwheel, and here you can actually choose from some already existing palettes that you can just steal, basically. And of course, if you don't like it, well, then just change it to your liking. Using the color ramp is actually a pretty good idea, because this way, as you can see, you have some variations between those colors that you set here. But if for some reason you need very specific colors, you can even change that. And then you can actually create, let's say, 3 very specific colors that you want to use here. And you will not have any variation between them, but only explicitly those colors. So very powerful, as you can see, and this is something you very often need, and especially beginners often ask for this function. So the attribute adjust color node is a good way of doing this. So here you can see what I mean with it. It doesn't do one particular thing, but it offers you all kinds of functions in the context of colors. The best way is to simply play around with this a little bit and try to remember all the things it can do, so that you can, when you need a particular function, remember it later on. Let's move on. The next one I want to talk about is the attribute adjust vector. Now this is more important later on, to be fair, but I quickly want to show you so that you at least have seen it. Now the first function that we actually already used in the copy to points examples is the possibility to rotate a vector around another vector. So what I can do here, for example, is I can use the statue and copy it onto a line so that we have a couple of them. There you go. And the first thing is they are currently aligned, they're not aligned actually, they just stand there because the line node doesn't have a normal, not even an automatic one. One way of creating a normal here, when it can't be calculated automatically for curves, so a normal node, for example, will not work. It will not create, if I set it to points, for example, it will not create anything because that's a curve. We will talk about this later. So what we could do is an attribute create or an attribute adjust vector. And here we can simply set the attribute n to a particular direction. So let's set it and set it to the direction 0, 1, 0. And here you can see this is how we can set a normal. And the reason I'm showing this to you is I want to first make sure that our statues are standing upright. And as we've learned, they always align their z-axis to n. So let's change the current number to something like this so that they stand upright. And let's quickly show this to you. There you go. This is how our normals look like now. And because of the way the copy to points works, this is now how our pieces will stand up. What I wanted to show you, now that we have created this normal here, we can use another attribute adjust vector node to rotate it around. For example, we set it to direction only and then to rotate. And we can now rotate around a certain axis, for example, the axis of our line here. And I think it should already work. We just have to dial up the rotate angle. And here you can see, oh, nothing happens because it currently changes the attribute v. Let's change it to n and then it should work. And here you can see now we can rotate actually the vector n around another vector, so we can freely rotate them. And let's say what we wanted to do is we don't want to rotate all of them the same way. So we set the adjust width from constant to random. And here you can see now that we have a minimum rotation and a maximum rotation, and all of them will get a different rotation around the x-axis. I understand in this case that's pretty useless, I get it. So let's change this maybe, and we rotate them around the y-axis, and here you can see now they all have a different direction around y. And the cool thing is we can actually define the minimum rotation and the maximum rotation to really have very fine control about it. So again, there are a lot of functions here actually, not just rotate, random, min, max. You also can have a spread, which kind of adds a random direction on top of the whole thing. When you use rotate, you can change to noise as well. You can also change from min, max to specific values, so they can only have particular rotations. So all kinds of functions in here that you can add, way too many to show them all. Again, the best thing is to just play around with them. Just remember, what I find this node very useful for is rotating vectors around certain directions in a very controlled way, which you need all the time. Then when it comes to vectors, you sometimes don't want to just change them, you also just want to create them. So for example, if you wanted to have a random normal on these points here in random direct, you could of course use an attribute randomize, or if you want to have a noise, use an attribute noise. We will talk about those things later on. But both functions are actually built in the attribute adjust vector node, where you can set the direction to set and then, for example, random, and let's set the attribute to a normal so that we can see it. There you go. And here you can see they get random directions, and you can even change in which directions they should go. There you go. So that's one way of creating random directions. Or you can create noised directions, which means they have some kind of pattern. Again, we will talk about this later. So you can create all kinds of directions with the help of the attribute adjust vector, be it random or be it based on a noise. The next thing is we can also work with floats. So in this case, for example, I used a scatter node to scatter points, and then I just copied spheres to it. And what I want to have now is different scales of those spheres based on their position in space. So as we know, what we have to change is the attribute p scale. And for this, since it's a float data type, we can use again an attribute adjust float. And this allows for the same things we've already seen. P-scale is already the attribute that it changes because it's the most common thing. And then we can just set it to a particular number by set always, for example. There you go. That's not really impressive. We can do this with an attribute create node as well. But it has, again, those functions like noise built in, where you can use a noise function to create different scales, or you can use a random, or you can also use line, for example. By pressing enter again, you get this line in space that allows you to control the size of those spheres based on this line direction. Or you have again the radial, which is the same just for a sphere with a certain radius. And this way you can change the p-scale attribute, just like we saw with color, in this case just for float. And then it has the bounding box function, which is easier to show on a box. So here I have a box, and with the points from volume, I fill this with a grid of points and copy spheres to it. And let's make them a bit smaller actually. There you go. Now you can see that. Pretty straightforward. And now I want to control the p-scale again with an attribute adjust float. And here you can see the function bounding box again, which is cool because in 3 dimensions it makes the most sense, because you can say the size of my spheres should change based on where they are in the context of this object, maybe for the axis x or for y or for z. And this way you can scale them depending on where they are in space relative to the bounding box for X, Y, and Z, which sometimes is really handy if you want to change something, to go, and let's actually change the ramp here. Let's say you want something to go smaller the higher it is in space. We will see how to do this in Vex later on, which is the Houdini internal programming language. But for now, the attribute adjust float node allows for a lot of these complex things that are not possible otherwise. And then you will find the same for the attribute adjust integer node. And this, for now, I will skip because I'm just repeating myself. And for integer, there are not too many useful cases. The other stuff is much more useful. But if you look into the node, here you can see you have all those functions again that we've already seen. You can create random integer or based on a noise pattern or based on a line and so on. So it repeats itself. So if you have something that is based on integers, you can use this node as well. So as you can see, the attribute adjust nodes are pretty powerful. Again, because they do so many things, I have a hard time integrating them in a reasonable way into the course, but I wanted to show them to you so that you remember them. And very often you could use them when I show you a different way of doing things, because I'm a little bit old school, but I would encourage you to try them out. They might be more inclined with your way of thinking, and there are always multiple solutions to the same problem in Houdini, and the attribute adjust nodes are certainly a very powerful bunch of tools in your arsenal. So I hope this is helpful and not too confusing. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.